Thank you so much, Rita. I appreciate the great introduction. My name is Greg Woodring. I'm president of Ann Arbor Public Power, and we have a presentation here for you tonight. I'm probably going to move through some of it a little bit quicker because I expect you all to be a little bit more up to date on some of these things based off of the previous. Oh, that didn't work. Slideshow. Based off the previous presentation that you got, as well as just your general awareness for being commissioners. But if I slide over anything that you are more interested in hearing about, feel free to just ask me to go into more detail. I'm very open to that. But without further ado, we are Ann Arbor for Public Power. So who is Ann Arbor for Public Power? What is Ann Arbor for Public Power? Well, we're a coalition of members from various local organizations. We have representation from DSA, Sunrise, Indivisible, Climate Action Movement, Washtenaw 350, Ann Arbor Beyond Bernie, GEO, Fridays for Futures. We recently got an endorsement from Our Revolution Michigan, which was very much appreciated. So we managed to build a decent coalition of people doing work in and around Ann Arbor. And fundamentally, what we believe in is a green and publicly owned future. We want to democratize, decommodify, decarbonize, and decolonize our energy sources. And so what is it the problem that we're facing, right? The problem in Ann Arbor is that DTE is not transitioning to renewable energy fast enough to meet our global or local emissions targets, right? DTE is actually the third dirtiest major utility in the country. This is their most recent fuel mix that they published for last year. They burned about 58% coal. That's up 8% from the year prior. About 10% fracked gas. They got about 23% of their power from nuclear and about 9.5 from renewables. And that renewables, in fact, is a little bit misleading because some of that renewable energy, actually a decent portion of that renewable energy, is actually burned garbage, which I don't think many of us would consider exactly eco-friendly. And so, just to kind of illustrate that point, right? Ann Arbor has set an ambitious, but I believe reachable carbon neutrality date of 2030. President Joe Biden's also set a carbon-free electricity date of 2035. However, DTE's target date is 2050. About 20 years past what the IPCC tells us is the minimum to reach in order to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis. And DTE doesn't really even have a real plan to reach that 2050 timeline. They plan to continue to operate 12 coal-fired generators until 2040, which is 10 years past when we need to get off of coal. And they're also continuing to invest in fracked gas infrastructure. In fact, they seem to believe that they are going to be able to make fracked gas carbon neutral, which is pretty unrealistic according to a lot of the science on this topic, which probably don't need to go into a ton of detail with all of you, but generally we consider this technological wishful thinking. They believe that there is going to be some sort of magical technology in the future that is able to make fracked gas carbon neutral, which is definitely yet to be seen. And so what do we think is the solution to this problem, and what is the reason for our existence and why we're here talking today is we believe that through municipalization, we'll be able to achieve our city's energy goals. So what is municipalization? Essentially, municipalization is just the process of taking something that is privately owned and putting it under the ownership of a city. Right? So there's plenty of other municipal owned utilities in the country. In fact, our water and sewer comes from a municipal utility. Most water and sewer comes from a municipal utility. And there's actually a lot of communities across the United States, over 2,000, that gets their energy from a municipal electric utility. And over 40 of those are in Michigan alone. And there's not really a big wonder as to why that is. It's explicitly protected by the state constitution to allow cities to municipalize their energy grid. You can see here a map of the different municipal utilities across the country or across the state. Some of the big ones: Lansing, Holland, Chelsea, Traverse City, Holland. And why is it that we believe that a municipal utility is going to be right for Ann Arbor? What is it about a municipal utility that outcompetes this IOU model, this investor-owned utility model, right? Well, there's 5 main areas that we identify: reliability, affordability, affordability, local control, the fact that it invests in our community, and finally, and I think probably most important to most of the people here listening today, is the environmentally responsible choice. So reliability. On average, a public power utility loses power about half as often as their IOU counterparts nationwide, right? The average outage for a public power utility per year is about 74 minutes. And the average outage for an IOU, an investor-owned utility nationwide, is about 136 minutes. But that doesn't exactly tell the whole story in Michigan. In fact, in Michigan, it's considerably worse. DTE in 2017, where we pulled these numbers, and I guarantee you that if you looked at some of the more recent numbers, they'd probably be worse. DTE lost about a little over 1,000 minutes back in 2017. City of Lansing, by comparison, the city's largest municipal utility, lost just a little bit over 250. That's about a 4 times less outage, right? Which means their power went out less often and it came back up quicker. Affordability. It is also cheaper. So you get better service for a cheaper rate. On average, nationwide, a municipal utility tends to pay about 14% less than their IOU counterparts. And once again, that is not quite the same extent in Michigan. Ann Arbor under DTE, and it's actually gone up since these numbers were pulled. But when these numbers were pulled, we're about 17.51 cents per kilowatt hour. It's about 18-ish now. Chelsea, our next door neighbor by comparison, spent about 10.15 cents per kilowatt hour. That is a 40% less that they are paying for their energy. And really the reason is because they're a municipal owned utility, right? In fact, Chelsea doesn't buy different power than we do, right? They write a check to DTE every year to buy their power, but they're able to collectively bargain on it, right? And they're able to buy energy at a considerably cheaper rate because of the advantageous position that they're put into by buying this in bulk as a city. Now, we don't just believe we should do this because it's cheaper, better power, though. Many might be able to argue that that's enough of a reason, but we have more to it than that. A municipal energy utility will give us local control, right? With the municipal energy utility, we have pretty much control over everything that we do with our power. We would control our rates, we would control where our power comes from, and we would control when our infrastructure is updated, right? A recent state study showed that DTE's infrastructure, a large portion of it was about 40 years past its functional end of life, which means that it should have been replaced back in the 80s, and yet it's still in operation here today, right? That is a large contributing factor to these reliability concerns that we have, and it's simply a decision that we wouldn't need to make if we owned it ourselves. Also, it invests in our community, right? And I can get into the details of pilot versus taxes and how municipal utilities actually contribute quite a bit more money back to their community through what's called a city fee than investor-owned utilities typically pay back in taxes. But it also means that we're going to be investing in good jobs in our local community, right? Jobs that would be protected by our responsible contracting policies, right? That we'd be able to build in union protections to. It would allow us to build a modern and reliable infrastructure, right? And a modern, reliable energy grid. We know that the future of energy is not these large investor-owned coal-fired power plants or large centralized power plants, right? The future of energy is the distributed network of reliable infrastructure that is able to stand up to the ravages of climate change, right? These storms and things that cause these outages are only going to get worse, and we need to become more resilient if we want to overcome that, right? And finally, and what I think is probably the most convincing to personally us and likely many of you, it's the environmentally responsible choice. In short, it allows us to reach our climate goals on our own terms. We do not need to rely on what DTE decides is profitable for them to invest in. We are able to seek out our own renewable power and buy that power instead, right? There's two basic ways that we would be able to get power with a municipal energy utility, right? We'd be able to obviously use as much power as generate as much power as we possibly can within the city, right? We can invest in rooftop solar. We can provide programs that will help incentivize rooftop solar and make it affordable to people, right? Things like on-bill financing. Many of these same policies that the SEU is looking to implement, the muni would also be able to implement them, and it would have the advantage of being able to do it at a larger scale because it would be the entire city that would be involved in this rather than subscribers. And it would also allow us to get over many of these restrictions that DTE has put on us, right? DTE currently puts a 1% cap on local distributed energy generation. That is at the discretion of your utility, right? If we had our own municipal owned utility, we'd be able to eliminate that cap. Also, DTE, since we made this slide, has started lobbying to try to put a tariff on every homeowner with rooftop solar. Estimates are that homeowners with rooftop solar are going to be paying about $100 extra per month in their energy bills just for having rooftop solar. We wouldn't need to do that, right? That is at the discretion of the utility, and that's something that we'd be able to overcome with our own municipal energy utility. And also, just to prove the point, there are exactly 6 utilities in America at the moment that have a 100% renewable fuel mix. All of them are publicly owned utilities, either cooperatives or municipal utilities. And so let's talk about funding. This is obviously one of the big issues, right? How much is this going to cost? Is it going to lead to increased taxes? Is it going to bankrupt the city? And there's serious questions to ask. However, thankfully, I think we have a good answer for you on that one. So typically, the way that you fund municipalization is that you do it through a revenue bond, right? So the city, which they're currently working on at the moment, will fund a feasibility study, and that will evaluate exactly, at least within the ballpark, how much is it going to cost to buy out this infrastructure, right? Then it's going to estimate how much money is it going to take to run this utility and how much money will we get back in the rates, right? DTE is already charging us quite a bit in rates. Instead of that money going to DTE, that money would then be going to the city. And there's going to be almost certainly money left over. And pretty much every single city that has undergone this procedure, there is considerable money left over, and that pays for the service on the debt for the bonds, right? So the muni pays for itself. And in fact, in most communities, there's actually even more than that. And that's money that's able to go back to the city and be reinvested in any programs that the city wants, right? It can go towards more sustainability or parks or water. Well, I don't know if it can go to water, but it can go to a lot of whatever the city wants. So yeah, it doesn't raise taxes, provides additional funding. In short, it's the cheapest way that we possibly could reach our climate goals because it's going to make us money. And here's a graph that kind of illustrates how that works out for other communities across the state, right? All of these communities are of very different sizes, but I can assure you that this is a decent amount of money for each of them. Traverse City, back in 2020, where I pulled these numbers from their financial statements, made $1.6 million. Holland made $7.6 million, and Lansing made a whopping $23.1 million money written back to the city. So now I've got a bit of a thing on the legal history. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker because I think that many of you are up to date, but essentially this outlines the details of the Foot Act, right? So back when electricity was new and people were trying to electrify, some cities went down the path of creating their own municipal utilities. Most of the municipal energy utilities you see in Michigan nowadays come from this era where they stood it up themselves and built out their own infrastructure. Many communities couldn't afford to do that, right? And they relied on private funding to be able to do it. And if someone's going to provide private funding, they're going to expect a return on their investment. And that makes a certain amount of sense. So the cities would agree to what's called a franchise agreement. And they would say, for a set amount of time, 5, 10, 20, 30 years, we will only buy power from you. However, in 1905, there was an effort to standardize how these contracts were being done, right? Every city had their own contract, and it was a bit of the Wild West. And the state wanted to say that there is a standard way to enter into these contracts, and they rewrote all of them. Now, Foote was the last name of a man who sat on the board of a company called Consumers Energy. And it just so happened that there was a clause within that Foote Act that when they rewrote all these franchise agreements, they happened to leave out the expiration date on all of these agreements. So now pretty much every city in Michigan, not all of them, but most of them had these contracts back in 1905, and they became Foot Act franchises that were indefinite. And they provided an indefinite franchise agreement to that utility forever. In 1907, people got really mad about this. They passed a amendment to the state constitution saying that no franchise agreement can last more than 30 years. The Supreme Court then heard a case brought to them challenging this amendment. The Supreme Court of Michigan found that, yes, this amendment will apply to all future franchise agreements, but it doesn't apply to previous ones, which is a bit frustrating because they kind of just rewrote all the contracts and they said, well, you can't modify a contract. But over the next 100-some years, this was held up time and time again, and it's become rather established law. In fact, they actually expanded this to say that a company buying another company that holds these franchise agreements actually inherits them. So Ann Arbor signed a contract back in 1895, I believe, to a company, I think it was called the Michigan Electric Company, a small little company, and it was providing power to 26 different electric light bulbs in Ann Arbor. That agreement became a Foot Act franchise agreement, which then got bought by another company, that got bought by another company, that eventually got bought by DTE. And to this day, DTE now has a perpetual franchise agreement in Ann Arbor, and nobody is allowed to compete with them for providing power. Except there is one exception to the Foot Act franchise, and that is that a city can always have a right to its own franchise. A city is able to provide power to itself. So if we ever want to get out from under the boot of DTE and their deceptive business practices and their corrosive impact on our state legislator and the fact that they are undermining renewable efforts across the state and even the nation. There was a recent report that showed that they're heavily lobbying to influence energy policy within the state of California. Then we're going to need to do it ourselves. We're going to need to break away from them. So how do we do that? How is it that we municipalize? Well, luckily, we already did the first step. The city council commissions a feasibility study, and this feasibility study evaluates many of those key metrics that I mentioned before, such as the cost of acquiring assets and how much money it'll make, and if it will be able to cover the price of the bonds with the money that it makes. Then it goes to the ballot. The state constitution requires that this be done on the ballot by a vote of the people, and it needs at least a 60% vote in that election, right? So it needs 60% yes in the election that it's held. What that will do is it establishes the governance structure and authorizes the city to begin negotiations with DTE to purchase out their infrastructure. Now, DTE is not exactly likely to be very friendly to this idea, and they probably will not agree to the price that the city offers. So what that means is it's going to have to likely go to court, and a court will decide what is the price of these assets. Once the court has decided what the price of the assets are, there's one more vote where we authorize the funding to actually purchase out the infrastructure. And after that, we've got our muni, right? We're able to start moving aggressively towards 100% renewable electricity in Ann Arbor. And, I wanted to throw this in because a lot of this conversation is centering around a lot of the exciting stuff that the city is doing with the sustainable energy utility. I just want to say that Ann Arbor for Public Power is excited about the sustainable energy utility. We see it as a good first step at moving towards 100% renewable power. It allows us, hopefully at least, to get started quickly on getting more resilient local power generation. But there's always going to be a bit of a bottleneck here, right? It's a subscriber-based program. People are going to have to opt into it. The city's RFP that they recently released estimated at its highest a 50% buy-in rate on the SEU, right? So we can get started on the SEU. We can start to get people installing their own home solar. And in the same time, we can work towards municipalization, right? Which is going to be able to get us to that 100% mark, right? The SEU also is not going to have access to buy power from outside of the city, right? It's not going to have access to those power purchase agreements that would allow us to buy power from other renewable power generation sources outside of the city. municipalization would open that door for us, right? So I see, and I think that this is a general opinion of Ann Arbor for Public Power. We see that these are complementary plans, right? We can get started quickly on doing whatever we can without buying the infrastructure. And then once we get that infrastructure, we're able to move quickly and do the rest of the job. And I just want to leave you with a few successful examples of municipalization from across the country. So Long Island, New York, back in 1998, municipalized their energy utility. They now serve well over 1 million customers, and they managed to reduce their electric rates by an average of 20%. Winter Park, Florida, they actually gave us a fantastic presentation to the Energy Commission back in October of 2021, and I highly recommend that people go back and look at it. They municipalized their power back in 2005. They were primarily concerned about reliability. They were being hit by a lot of hurricanes, and their power was being knocked out, and they were being left in the dark for weeks because typically the power utility would prioritize the coast. So they municipalized their energy utility, and they aggressively started to underground their wires. They're on track to get to 100% of their wires undergrounded. At the time of the presentation last year, that they were at about 84%. And they did this while paying off the debt on the infrastructure, right? So they were able to pay off the debt of acquiring all the infrastructure and had excess revenue that was able to go back into infrastructure investments. In Jefferson County, Washington, in 2008, and I think that this is probably one of the more impressive ones, voted to establish the municipal electric utility. They negotiated with their utility for 2 years, and they were eventually agreed to a $103 million buyout. And then they were able to get to a 97% carbon-free electricity mix, which is one of the cleanest in the country. Hopefully soon to be beaten by Ann Arbor, though, at 100%. And finally, and I think that this one might be surprising to some people, Boulder, Colorado. A lot of people think of Boulder, Colorado as the boogeyman of municipalization, right? Boulder, Colorado fought a very hard battle for about 10 years during their municipalization fight, and they eventually ended up settling and not going through with municipalization. But that settlement came with some significant benefits. Of them, an assurance of an 80% statewide greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. So they were fighting to get 100% renewable power within Boulder, much the same reasonings that we want to do this here, right? They didn't get that, but they got 80% statewide, which is a much bigger impact than one city. And they also established check-ins where if the utility was not meeting their obligations, they were able to restart the whole process and go back towards municipalization. They also got agreements that allow them to upgrade their grid and be able to do more distributed energy generation and underground their wires to enhance the reliability. So this is really the way that you put pressure on a utility, right? Obviously, Ann Arbor for Public Power, we're looking for the whole enchilada, right? Public power is a better system. It would lead to more reliable, cheaper, and more cleaner energy for Ann Arbor. But even just fighting this fight is going to force concessions out of DTE. So we think that it's a slam dunk. Very excited to present it to you, and I'm very interested to hear any questions that any of you had. I moved through things a little bit quickly because I wanted to be able to give you some time to be able to ask questions, but happy to go into more detail on any of this. That's our website right there, AnnArborPublicPower.org. We've got a lot of different info on there, so please check it out if you have any questions as well. But yeah, I want to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Greg. That was really excellent. And I would like to offer the opportunity for commissioners to ask questions. I see Commissioner Marzan's hand up. Please proceed.
I have, thanks for the presentation, it was wonderful. I have 2 questions. The first is, what's the estimated time frame for municipalization in Ann Arbor? And the second is, do you have any examples of municipalities that had their own power utility and decided to sell it back to a private company or a public company, but not run by the city?
Yeah. So first off, estimated timeline. So we're hoping to be able to bring this to ballot in 2023. It's going to rely on the feasibility study finishing in time. But we are currently working with our lawyers to draft that ballot amendment language, and we'll be collecting signatures, hopefully starting here in August, to be able to put that on the ballot. You know, I can't give you an exact estimate of how long it's going to take to fight the battle to acquire the assets. Like I mentioned, many communities, they look at about 2 years. At the most extreme, you know, you see like 10 years. Obviously, I'm hoping we're going to be able to move as quickly on this as possible. But, you know, even if it is 10 years, I remember a quote from Jeff Irwin, State Senator Jeff Irwin, when we first started this. And we were talking to him and he said, you know, we were talking about this 10 to 15 years ago. And we're like, well, yeah, it'd be great, but gosh, it could take 10 to 15 years. So, you know, certainly don't want to be sitting in that position. As in terms of communities that have decided to sell their municipal utility back, well, I can give you one, and it's Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor actually had a municipal electric utility back into the early 20th century, and they decided to sell it off. But it's not an uncommon thing. Cities end up into budgetary trouble. It's a very profitable thing for a private investor to be able to own. And they tend to pretty aggressively try to go after cities going to pressure them to sell off their municipal energy utility. Dennis Kucinich famously fought a battle against a privatization effort back in Cleveland, and it was pretty dirty. In fact, there's plenty of articles that write about how he faced assassination attempts throughout that process. So yeah, I mean, this is serious business. It's big money here. And private utilities want to own these things because it is an absolute cash cow for them. It's one of the most reliable investments you can make because it's state enforced. There is a percentage that the state guarantees a private utility will get in profit, right? And one of the reasons why it's just so much easier for a municipal utility to perform better than these IOUs is because they simply don't have to shave off that money off the top to go to shareholders, right? They're able to take every dollar that people are paying for their energy and put it back into making a better energy utility for their community.
Commissioner Gruber?
Thank you. That was very informative. I wonder if you know, you mentioned the example in Jefferson County and that they're at 97% renewables. Do you know if that example or another example where they were able to put source from a lot of renewables, but also reduce the cost to the consumers?
You know, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the cost breakdown for Jefferson County, Washington was. Certainly, you know, there is a balance there, right? Can I guarantee that if Ann Arbor municipalizes, especially with their ambitious climate goals, that they're going to be paying less for their electricity out the gate? No. There is a very good chance that Ann Arbor is going to be paying similar or more rates out the bat, especially if we're going to aggressively pursue our climate goals. However, over time, pretty much in every single case, municipal energy utilities end up paying less, right? The rate of rate increases is much slower with municipal energy utilities. And you can look at examples all over the country and the state for that, right? There's a lot of these municipal energy utilities, well, pretty much every single municipal energy utility in Michigan pays less for their power. They're also fairly well established. So, you know, there may be a bit of a ramp up, but you also got to look at this of what is the cost of climate change, right? What is the cost of inaction on climate, right? So, you know, I'm very excited for a feasibility study to be able to lay out some of the cost breakdowns. I definitely believe that we're going to be able to stay competitive to DTE just because of how much that they pull out of our system. But if we want to aggressively pursue reliability and aggressively pursue renewable energy, we might end up paying a little bit more. The great thing, though, is that this is something that the voters would be able to have a say in, right? It's suddenly under Democratic control, and we get to choose our own priorities rather than have them handed to us by a company that's really only interested in making money.
Other questions? Greg, I have one.
All right.
If anyone else has one, please join in. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit of your discussion on some of the legal issues that might come up and complexities related to that?
Legal issues related to municipalizing?
Right.
Certainly. Yeah. So Ann Arbor Public Power, when we first started going into this is kind of the thing we cut our teeth on to begin with, right? We really, the legal history of this was pretty hard to untangle. And we were getting conflicting answers from different people about exactly how legal was this. We decided to commission a legal report from the law firm OBH up in Traverse City. The partner that worked on this was Chris Mizdock, former mayor of Traverse City, and also served on the Traverse City Board of Power and Light there. Very experienced in utility matters and also a very well accomplished environmental lawyer. And they did a legal analysis that showed pretty concretely that this is a legal path for us, right? It is built into the DNA of the state constitution, as Chris Bisnock put it. And he did a really excellent explanation of this in a roundtable that we held a few months ago, which I'd be happy to share with the commission. But there's certainly, DTE is not going to take this rolling over, right? They may not be able to oppose our ability to do it, but they certainly are going to try to slow down the process as much as they can on trying to get the valuation of the assets, right? Now, there are formulas for how you value the assets, right? There are going to be a few things that people squabble over, right? One of the big ones is typically stranded costs, right? Stranded costs are essentially the utility is going to claim that there is so much infrastructure that they used to support Ann Arbor that we aren't buying, that we need to compensate them for, right? This is something that tends to be pretty fiercely negotiated within municipalization battles. Winter Park, Florida gave some really good insights into this in their presentation to the Energy Commission. They did not believe that they should have had to pay nearly the amount of stranded asset costs that they did. They ultimately ended up agreeing to pay some of them because they just wanted to end the legal battle. So these are the considerations that have to be taken into effect, certainly. And, you know, the city has some fairly well-accomplished lawyers that will be able to fight this battle out. But yeah, it's certainly, there are issues that are going to come up. And it's also been the first time in about 100 years that this has happened in Michigan, right? The last city to do this was Traverse City back in about 1920s. And so there's going to be a little bit of figuring it out for everyone involved at the state level, you know, in the courts and things like that, which we see as something that it is a challenge, right? But it also is an opportunity. If Ann Arbor is able to municipalize, we will have established a legal roadmap for it. We will have shown everyone in the state how it is that you can break free of your municipal or of your investor-owned utility. And that will open up the door for other communities across the state to follow in the same pathway. That's going to be very scary to the investor-owned utilities. And that is going to force them to either come to the table and meet the demands of these communities, or face the prospect of the same thing that happened in Ann Arbor is going to happen across the country or across the state. Which we see as very exciting, right? It's a way for us to both find something better for our community, as well as help everyone else in the state to reach, you know, their goals and to build towards that renewable energy future that we absolutely need to move to, right? There's no real choice in the matter. We've got to get off of these fossil fuels, and this is just the most effective way to do it.
Thank you. I see Commissioner Gruber has another question.
Thank you. That conversation there just made me think about, you gave some great examples from Florida and Washington and other Colorado. Were the state laws in those states comparable to what we have here in Michigan? Were they also going over this hurdle of 100 years? It's been 100 years since they've municipalized. Can you share some similarities or differences between those?
Yeah, definitely. So some communities have it easier, some communities have it harder. Boulder in Colorado, they had it harder. There was a lot, it's not built into their state constitution that they're allowed to do this. And also there was ways that they did it. They made a few mistakes along the pathway of, you know, how they were structuring these proposals that left them open to legal liability earlier in the process than probably should have been able to be done, right? This utility was able to sue before they actually started trying to acquire the assets. In communities like Winter Park, Florida, it was a bit easier, right? They didn't have these perpetual franchise agreements that we have, which allowed them to be able to essentially just cancel their franchise agreement rather than having to go through the condemnation process the same way. So yeah, it's a different, every state's going to be a different legal case. You're going to have your benefits and pluses in your law. We're certainly not in the easiest state to do it, but we also are in a state where it is not really a question of whether it's legal, right? Sometimes you go down these pathways and it's like, it might be legal, right? Based on interpretation. In Michigan, it is in the state constitution. It outlines the mechanism by which you do this, right? So that's a huge advantage that we have.
Great, thank you. I think this should be our last question just because of the time. So thank you, Kathy, Commissioner Griswold, Councilmember Griswold.
Yes, Greg, I just want to thank you and say I have heard this presentation a few times, and every time I hear it, I learn something new and it's equally interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. All right. Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate your being patient with coming back a second time, and thanks. And we'll stay in touch. We'll have this presentation on our in our minutes and available for everyone to view at any time.
Fantastic. Thank you. And feel free to reach out with any questions that any of you have.
Great. Thanks.